Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's make a start. My name is Matt. I'm one of the conveners at researchEDHome, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation. We are delighted, it's one of our fancy international presentations today, so delighted to have Greg Ashman join us. I think you're in Victoria, Greg, is that right?
Yeah, a beautiful town of Ballarat.
Ballarat in Victoria. Greg is a teacher. I think he's also doing a PhD at the moment, and is a writer and blogger on all things education. So great to have Greg join us today. Greg, thank you very much for being here. I'm going to hand straight over to Greg, who's going to take us through his presentation today. We've then got some time for questions and answers at the end. Do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can post those questions at any time during the presentation, and Greg will then answer those at the end. Remember, this presentation is being recorded and so will be available on the researchEDHome Twitter page later today, so you can share it with your colleagues, use it for CPD in your school, or any of those other fantastic uses. So nothing else from me. Greg, going to hand over to you. Really looking forward to your presentation today.
Cheers, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about explicit teaching, critical thinking and creativity. Let me just share my presentation for you guys. So I'm going to talk about explicit teaching, critical thinking and creativity. I've been doing some research and thinking around this for a new book that will be out shortly, called The Power of Explicit Teaching and Direct Instruction. So hopefully you might find something interesting there, but you don't have to wait. If you can't, if you're desperate to get a book that I've written, I've got The Truth About Teaching out, which you can get your hands on right away if you want. But anyway, this is some thinking I've been doing around critical thinking and creativity in the context of explicit teaching. So first up is my straw man. Okay, so here's my straw man. You can have a read of what he's saying there. Okay, so I've made the point that he is a straw man because whenever I say things like this, whenever I make statements like this, that people think these things, people often tell me that I'm attacking a straw man argument. It's a type of logical fallacy where you create a position that isn't real and then you attack that position. And so we've got this straw man saying explicit teaching is fine for rote memorization of disconnected facts, but we need other methods for teaching critical thinking, creativity and problem solving. Now, maybe you haven't heard that, but I've got a couple of quotes which from actual people and papers that I think do illustrate this attitude. So I don't think it is actually that much of a straw man. So we've got Cynthia Scott writing a UNESCO working paper in 2015. Traditional approaches emphasizing memorization or the application of simple procedures will not advance learners' critical thinking or autonomy. To develop the higher order skills they now need, individuals must engage in meaningful, inquiry-based learning that has genuine value and relevance for them personally and their communities. So that's 2015. Then we've got this year in The Guardian, Alice O'Keefe, not an educationist, but writing on education nonetheless, as a lot of people tend to do. If we can predict nothing else about the future, we know that it's going to involve a rapidly accelerating pace of change, from the growth of AI to a warming climate. Coping with this level of uncertainty will require adaptability and psychological resilience. These are best fostered by an education system that prioritizes not traditional academic learning, but rather the 4 C's: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. So maybe I'm imagining this attitude, maybe I've concocted this as an easy thing to argue against, but I don't think so. I think that people really do see a conflict between explicitly teaching a body of knowledge to students and goals that I think we can all agree are desirable, such as fostering critical thinking and creativity and problem solving in a wider sense. And we'll get to that later. In other words, critical thinking is seen as something that is other. It's different, it's separate. You've got academic learning here, which we can do, or you've got these skills that we can foster over here. Or maybe it's like this and the skills sit on the top. So I think there is a perception out there that that you do need to use different methods to foster these things. Anyway, going back to my straw man, a straw man is an example of a logical fallacy. Okay, so here we have, well, you can see it. I think it's the Twitter bird, and voicing an example of what we could call the ad hominem fallacy. So there's other fallacies. There's a whole load of these logical fallacies. So an ad hominem fallacy is when instead of attacking someone's argument, you attack them and their characteristics. So, and it could be quite gentle and quite polite, but it could still be an ad hominem because you're dismissing what they're saying on the basis of who they are rather than the argument itself. So logically, it cannot refute the argument. Another logical fallacy that is quite common in education actually is no true Scotsman. So the example is Jack says no Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge, and John says, well, I know Angus and he's a Scotsman and he puts sugar on his porridge. And then Jack says, well, no true Scotsman. So you're redefining the thing after the fact to make sure that you were right. And we get this often in education, and it's the result of quite a complex problem. And then it's hard to implement educational initiatives at a large scale. So someone will run a trial. So I'll give you an example of a trial of differentiation run a few years ago in the US, across, I think it was 3 states. And beforehand, they had high hopes. They thought that this teaching people about differentiation would have a huge impact on on the achievement of students. But when they ran the study, they found that it didn't have much of an impact at all. And then they said, yes, well, that's because people didn't do it properly. So if it had been proper differentiation, then it would have worked, but they didn't do it properly. And without sort of going into and defining that, that is an implementation issue. And you can be very specific about that. And obviously things will fall apart if they're not implemented properly. But equally, we could say, oh, well, it would have worked if it was done properly without ever being clear about what properly means. That would be an example of the true Scotsman fallacy. And the false choice. So when you're offering 2 alternatives, as if they're the only alternatives, but actually there's a lot of space in between. So you can, so if I were to say to you, you can either be a communist or a fascist, you might object and say, well, actually, there's quite a lot of other positions I could take. So just because I'm not a communist doesn't mean I'm a fascist. Just because I'm not a fascist doesn't mean I'm a communist. So, and people often frame arguments in terms of false choice to try and force you into a category that you might not necessarily want to be in. Now, why have I spent some time talking about logical fallacies? Well, the purpose of this presentation really is to talk about explicit teaching and its relationship to things like critical thinking and creativity. And by talking about logical fallacies, I've discussed some things, some ideas that seem generally applicable. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about science or literature or history. If you make a logical fallacy and someone can identify that logical fallacy, then these logical fallacies are relevant. So they can be relevant across all these different domains, which is interesting. So it makes you think, well, wait a bit, is this something then that we could teach if we want to develop students' critical thinking skills in a general sense, rather than, you know, teaching science or history or whatever, or maybe in addition to, we could teach them about logical fallacies. Is this a good candidate for the sort of thing we could do if we want to teach critical thinking? Okay, so it's general purpose, it's not subject bound. I think I made that point, right? So, well, you've got 2 problems if you, and this is just an exemplar really, the idea of the logical fallacies. It's just an example that we can get our teeth into. You've got 2 problems if you want to use this as your example of a different way of teaching critical thinking skills that doesn't rely on a traditional academic or standard academic curriculum. The first is, what would be the best way to teach students about logical fallacies? What's going to be the most effective way to do that? Well, they're concepts. You can imagine presenting some logical fallacies. You could imagine asking students to identify some logical fallacies, maybe create some. Maybe you could create one in front of them. And you could complete that process. You could go on, ask students, get more expertise. You could maybe embed the logical fallacies in longer text, so they have to read through the text and identify where they are. So that gradual release of control from the expert teacher to the students as they gain more expertise. And that approach would be a classic example of explicit teaching. Explicit teaching is an entire process. It's not just a single episode that happens for a bit of a lesson. Explicit teaching is that process of gradual release of control. So fully, completely guided at the start. Everything's modeled and examples are given by the teacher. And then it's interactive. So students are required to then do something, maybe use some of those examples or replicate some of the things that they've seen the teacher do. And then as we progress, we add in more variation, we add in more complication, we add in maybe redundant information, we add in maybe misleading information. We then maybe present different logical fallacies together in the same context, but the different fallacies, and so that adds a complication, and so on until we get to this point of expertise. And that's it. That's a classic approach to explicit teaching. And if you look at, say, for instance, and the slides showing you there, a book called Constructivist Instruction, Success or Failure by a range of people, edited by Tobias and Duffy. And in there, one of the chapters is written by Barak Rosenstein. And he goes through and illustrates that whatever it is you want to teach, even if it's something quite ill-structured, like reading comprehension or writing, the evidence suggests that explicit teaching, this process of gradual release, is the most effective way to do it. So he talks about process product research. He talks about experimental research. He talks about, you research using these ill-structured tasks. So there's no reason really to think that if we wanted to teach logical fallacies, if that was our big lever to improve kids' critical thinking, that we wouldn't use explicit teaching to do that. So that's the first issue. It doesn't necessarily, if we pick something that is seemingly general purpose like this, and we want to teach it to students, it doesn't necessarily imply that we need a completely different way of teaching. And in fact, the evidence would tend to suggest that explicit teaching is going to be a good bet. But there's a second problem with logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are useful up to a point. Someone could commit a logical fallacy and be right. So I've got an example here that I made up earlier. I don't believe David Icke's theory that the Earth has been hijacked by shape-shifting reptilian creatures because he is just a sports reporter turned conspiracy theorist. That would be an ad hominem. That doesn't address the substance of the argument. However, I think most of us would probably agree that it's right not to believe David Icke's theory that the Earth has been hijacked by shape-shifting reptilian creatures. I think most of us would be on board with that. So the identification of a logical fallacy in that statement is possibly misleading, even if you want to know what the truth is. Although it wouldn't be for other reasons, which I will come to. You could also avoid committing a logical fallacy and be wrong. So, for instance, the statement, all roads lead to Rome, this is a road, therefore this road must lead to Rome, is a logically consistent syllogism, but it's false. All roads don't lead to Rome. And it's false because the original premise is false. So if you start with a false premise, you can argue logically from that, and you can't spot the logical fallacies, but it's still wrong. But how do we know that these statements are right or wrong? Well, most of you watching this webinar would have had an opinion on those statements that was completely independent or not of whether there was a logical fallacy in there. And that's because you have broader knowledge. You have, I imagine, a very sophisticated knowledge of the world, which means that you've got your own evaluations of how the world is shaped and how it's run and how governments work and how control of different systems is in different people's hands. And this very complicated understanding probably makes you very skeptical of the ideas of David Icke. And similarly, you would have conceptions about roads, and you know a lot of roads, and you would know perhaps that all roads lead to Rome is more of a figurative statement. You'd have heard it in that context. So, and you might even know the history of it in terms of the Roman Empire and all that sort of stuff. So you've got this background knowledge, but the key thing is your background knowledge is specific to the substance of the statements. It's not generic, it's not general, which leads me, so the other thing, this is similar to an argument that Daniel Willingham makes in an article for American Educator. He says, we may decide that he doesn't say this, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting from him. So we may decide that a generally applicable critical thinking strategy is, for instance, to see an argument from multiple perspectives. Wouldn't it be good if we can teach our students to see arguments from multiple perspectives? Yes, this is a good critical thinking strategy. And so we might teach them, we might say, right, guys, we want you to, okay, what's another perspective on this? What's another perspective on this? We might do a little strategy that we teach them. But if our students don't know what these perspectives are, then the strategy is pretty useless. It doesn't really get you anywhere. They might know they've got to look at something from multiple perspectives, but if they don't know what they are, they can't do it. So I propose a rule of thumb that basically the more general something is, the more things you can apply it to, the less useful it tends to be. So knowledge of logical fallacies is applicable to a whole lot of different situations, but it's not hugely useful. It can be great for arguing with people on Twitter, perhaps, I don't know, but it's not hugely useful for determining the truth and falsehood of the underlying arguments. Although it could sometimes be a good rule of thumb. You know, if someone's got a silly name and is anonymous on Twitter and is being abusive, then they probably don't have the grasp on virology that enables them to make the statements that they're making. So it can be useful sort of rule of thumb. But the idea, so generally, what I'm suggesting is that essentially the more generally applicable something is, the less specifically useful it is. And more particularly, if something is more generally applicable, it will tend to be less useful than something that is not as widely applicable, but is more specific to the domain of knowledge that we're dealing with right now. However, my diagram there is quite smooth, and I don't think that that's actually correct. I think it's a little bit messier than that. So I'm going to hedge here a little and recognize that some concepts are perhaps more powerful than others. So, for instance, the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution, well, it's not like generally applicable to everything, but it has quite a lot of applicability. It works quite well across a lot of the biological sciences, geology. It can even have strange applications, say in information science, that sort of thing. So it's quite widely applicable, evolution by natural selection. And it's quite useful still in all those different domains. So I'm not saying that everything sits on a nice, neat line. And some things might be uniquely general and useful. I'm saying it's more of a general trend. As teachers, it's probably up to us, if we can identify these things like evolution by natural selection, that gives us a good guide actually as to what we should put in the curriculum, because they'll give us the biggest bang for our buck, because of this unique combination of usefulness and generalness. However, this is still quite unambitious. When we were thinking at the start about people wanting to revolutionize education and teach in a different way, get rid of explicit teaching, use inquiry learning to develop critical thinking skills, this seems a very unambitious version of that, if it is even a version of that at all, just identifying things that tend to max out on the useful in general. So what else is there that we could do? Okay, so here we've got W, who, when he was president, a lot of people thought he wasn't very good, I'll admit I was probably one of those people. However, I don't think at the time we realised that just how eccentric and a president could possibly be. Anyway, that's besides the point. George W. Bush, along with Tony Blair, took us into the Iraq War. So we have the September 11th attacks. We have the response in Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda were based, which seemed logical. There was a connection. Al-Qaeda had launched the September the 11th attacks. And then we had an invasion of Iraq, which didn't really seem, it seemed like a non sequitur. It didn't really seem to follow from that. But it was justified on the grounds that Iraq possessed these weapons of mass destruction. And so it needed to be done in order to remove these weapons of mass destruction. Now, it turns out that there doesn't seem to have been any. And many people would say, and I don't really want to take a side on this, but many people would say that the Iraq War was a huge mistake with all the chaos that ensued afterwards. So could this have been avoided with more skill in critical thinking? Now that might sound like an odd question to ask, like we've gone from this big conflict to a question about critical thinking, but it's not odd, because here's a quote from a guy, Swartz, and a whole bunch of other people who wrote a book called Thinking-Based Learning, Promoting Quality Student Achievement in the 21st Century. It's 2010 this book was published. And here's the quote. A presidential commission concluded that the various US intelligence agencies failed to validate the reliability of their sources in assessing pre-war conditions and events in Iraq. The reference, of course, is to those alleged weapons of mass destruction that served as the pretext for going to war in Iraq. Skillful thinking about the reliability of these sources could have avoided these problems. And yet, for some of the most important role models in the United States, failed to exhibit such thinking. It is our contention, the author's contention, that skillful thinking can and should be taught to students in our classrooms at every level. What does that mean? Like, it's quite a strong claim that if, I suppose we're meant to draw from that people like George W. Bush lacked these critical thinking facilities that we can teach to students in the classroom. How would you do that? Well, in a book called Education, Mind in the Knowledge Age by Carl Reiter, published in 2002, he reviews various methods proposed to teach students to just think better or more skillfully in some kind of general way. He goes from everything from the kind of, what do they call it? The brain training, that's it. So the brain training where you play like a computer program and it's supposed to increase your working memory capacity or something. And the studies and brighter notes, and the 18 years of research since then haven't really contradicted this. If anything, they've substantiated it, that students basically get better at playing the particular game that they train on in the brain training program, but it doesn't transfer to anything else. It doesn't improve their working memory in a general way. He talks about attempts to teach thinking as a sort of set of strategies. First do this, then do this, then do this, stepwise procedure. So I don't know, make a pro and con list or whatever it is. And he says, he refers to a bunch of experiments called think aloud. So what they do in these experiments, they get an expert to solve a problem, and the expert has to think aloud as they're solving the problem. And he notes that basically the way that experts think doesn't look anything like these strategies that we try and teach people in strategy training. And in fact, it's a lot messier, with a lot of looping back and moving through, and which you can probably quite imagine. So he's very skeptical about the idea that you could teach thinking. And he compares the idea of teaching students to think with an exhortation to teach them to digest. Let's teach students to digest. No one would propose that. And he says, and this is a quote, "Teaching thinking is treated as a straightforward manner, like teaching furniture refinishing. It does not occur to people to question whether a course that claims to teach it actually does so. Heeding the analogy to teaching digestion, I do not find it obvious that thinking is teachable at all, or indeed what it would mean to teach thinking." Okay, so right now I'm going to mention cognitive load theory. Now, I'm not asking you to accept cognitive load theory as definitive. I don't think anyone does. I think even the people that work on cognitive load theory realize that it is a theory that is in development. It's being tested all the time. I'm doing my PhD in the area, so I've done experiments expanding the ideas inside cognitive load theory. It's you don't have to. I'm saying you don't have to accept it. Okay. I'm not claiming that it's the truth or anything, and I'm just making that very clear, because there's a lot of people who are quite agitated about cognitive load theory at the moment. I think maybe in the UK it's become quite popular. But cognitive load theory says, and the image you're seeing is John Sweller in 2017 talking at a researchED conference in Melbourne. That's available on YouTube if you want to see that. He's talking about cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory says that there are basically two ways an individual can acquire new knowledge, things they didn't know already. That's either from others or by random guess and check. So they randomly try a move and they see if it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And if it does, well, hey. Now, I couldn't reconcile to this idea at all initially when I heard it. It seemed too simple. It seemed like Occam's razor, but, you know, like Occam's machete. It seemed as if it had been, it cut things down too much, made this too simple. For instance, I thought, well, surely experts can make better guesses than novices. Surely their guesses are not random. Well, yes and no. Now, this is my own diagram. This doesn't come out of cognitive load theory. It's my way of trying to illustrate what I think is going on here with this idea that if we accept the idea, there are only two ways that we can acquire knowledge, and that's either from other people, so we then assimilate it, or we use random guess and check. So what we've got here is a low knowledge individual. The red area shows their knowledge, and the boundary shows the boundary of their knowledge. And what we've got here is a problem to solve. And I'm going to define a problem solving in a really wide way to encompass really meta level, to encompass all the things that we might be trying to do that have some kind of goal. So for instance, solving a maths equation is an obvious one, but evaluating the veracity of a source, that's a critical thinking objective. Having an original idea that has value, that could be a goal. That's Sir Ken Robinson's definition of creativity, having an original idea that has value. So I think all of these things in a way can be thought of as a problem if you define problem in a very big way. And so we've got our knowledge that can take us up to this boundary, but our knowledge doesn't actually include the goal. So we don't know how to achieve the goal already. So once we get to the boundary, we have to start guessing and checking. And the blue arrows show the different ways we can go off when we do that. And you can see in this situation, there's lots of ways that we can go wrong and not move towards the goal state. So there'll be a lot of doing stuff, oh, no, that's not working. Or maybe not even know that it's not getting you close to the goal because you've got no way of testing. Now, if you've got a high knowledge individual and they're doing something new, they've been presented with something that they are trying to achieve that they haven't done before. The difference for them is that their knowledge boundary is much closer to the goal state to begin with. So I'll give you an example. When I was in my teens, I was in bands and And I was a self-taught guitarist, largely playing chords. And I used to marvel at these guys who could improvise solos. And I thought they must have some unique skill. They must be really talented. It took me ages to figure out that these guys knew pentatonic scales. And if you know a pentatonic scale, basically an improvised solo, you just play the notes in that scale in different orders. So they were being creative. They were solving a problem of creating something that hadn't existed before, a novel solution and a desirable novel solution. It had value, but they were starting from much closer to the goal state than I was. And so I think that's the difference between novices and experts. I don't think the experts have developed a special way of solving problems or a special skill of problem solving or anything else. I think the knowledge they've acquired has just meant that they can surf a lot closer to the goal before they have to start this random guess and check technique. Anyway, that's my view. Right, now, so if this is true, there is no real conflict between building student knowledge and teaching critical thinking or creativity. We could argue the better ways to build student knowledge, but that's a different argument, really. I would suggest that the evidence is fairly strong for explicit teaching for building student knowledge, but that if you want to see me argue that, you can look at my 2017 Melbourne researchED presentation, which is also on YouTube. But I don't think we should therefore be placing knowledge, traditional academic knowledge, the sort that's obtained from an academic curriculum, in opposition to the goal of developing critical and creative thinking. There are other considerations. I think, you know, it's not necessarily going to be emergent. It's not obvious that just by teaching knowledge that critical thinking will emerge, and certainly that's not my approach to it. I will teach in maths and physics what strategies to ensure that my students think critically about different situations. I don't just hope it'll emerge out of knowledge, but I think these things are very specific, very domain specific, very subject specific. I also think there's issues around personality, like Isaac Newton, great critical thinker, great problem solver from history, very cantankerous guy, quite happy to take a different view. And that's a personality trait. And I think it's an interesting question to the extent schools should be involved in personality, working with students' personalities. Is a personality a given? Is it something that we should aim to mold or shape? I think the one thing that we can do as schools, definitely, is work on school culture. So I think school culture is within our remit, and so we can make it acceptable to challenge ideas, we can make it acceptable to ask questions, we can make it acceptable to think differently within our culture. But I think the extent to which we should try and influence individual personalities, that's a very difficult question and a very different question. And I'm just going to finish. This is my personal copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paolo Freire. I took that photo earlier today. And I just wanted to mention this because I think Pedagogy of the Oppressed has two things to offer us here on two very different levels. First is Freire's own views on this. So Freire was very much against traditional forms of education. Here's the quote: "In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those who they consider to know nothing, projecting an absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as processes of inquiry." So to Freire, there are political considerations in how we teach. By standing at the front and explaining things to students, that's kind of like oppressive. So that's another thing that we can think about. I'm not sure that I buy any of that, really. I've read the book a few times. I think that it provides us with a false choice, really. I don't think teachers need to project absolute ignorance onto their students. I think you've just got to assume that if you're teaching them something new, they just don't know that new thing. They might know a lot of other things, but not that new thing. And half the time we're reviewing stuff that they already know because we know that retrieval practice and review is effective. So I'm not sure I'm convinced by that. But zooming out from the actual arguments Freire makes about education itself, most of his book is political, and it's about setting up, understanding the world through a dynamic between the oppressor and the oppressed. And in that sense, it's an application of this bigger thing called critical theory and applying that to education. And I would want to point out that critical theory is not critical thinking. Critical theory is a perspective on how to look at the world, to look at it through relations of power between the oppressed and the oppressors. But there are other perspectives. There are religious perspectives. There's classical liberalism. There's, democratic. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about the world, other than critical theory. And in fact, if all we did was teach critical theory, we would not be teaching critical thinking, because critical thinking, as we mentioned earlier, requires you to be able to look at things from multiple perspectives, and critical theory is just one. Anyway, I think that brings me to the end. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now, because while I was doing that, I couldn't really see anything else that was going on. So hopefully now I can. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. That was great and really interesting, thought-provoking. Colleagues, just a reminder that the Q&A function is open. So we've got a little bit of time, 5 to 10 minutes or so, to take any questions that you might have for Greg. If you do, pop them in the chat. We will give you a moment to do so. Maybe no questions for you, Greg, today. People have been,
well, there you go.
Or I've screwed up the settings, and so the chat.
I've flummoxed everybody.
It isn't open. I'm pretty sure. Here we go. I'm pretty sure I've not done that.
What's the practical takeaway? We should teach facts. Well, facts. Well, this is interesting. People tend to, when they want to be pejorative about explicit teaching, when they want to be pejorative, they talk about, oh, you're just teaching a bunch of disconnected facts. I don't think I've ever seen anyone structure a course so that they teach disconnected facts. I think facts can become disconnected, particularly in bodies of knowledge that you haven't used for a long time. So when people reflect back to their own schooling and they think about a subject that they dropped, when they were 14, it may appear to them that it was a bunch of disconnected facts. But usually it was presented with the aim of, however effectively, essentially building a schema of unconnected facts that you could use to apply to different problems and different scenarios. So we tend to structure things. We make links between things. We take things from one level to another. That's how we plan our teaching. Now, it's not always very effective, and there are more and less effective ways of teaching. But I don't think anyone sets out with the aim of teaching disconnected facts. And just teaching like a book of facts is not a very, I don't think it's something that teachers do, but it might be someone's perception looking back that that's what they were taught because of the sort of hindsight. I don't know if I've answered that question very well. Would the act of critiquing work aid the understanding of critical thinking? But it depends how you do it, I suppose. And in fact, in order to critique something properly, you have to know an awful lot of stuff. So yes, if you did that well, if you taught people the stuff they needed to know to properly critique something, then actually I think that would be very good at developing critical thinking. So if in maths, I will often say, what's wrong with this answer? Or what's wrong? Here's a model answer from a student. What have they done? What's wrong with it? Why doesn't that work? So I think that can be very powerful technique. But just this sort of where you sit around and nobody knows anything and you're supposed to critique something. I've seen that happen as well. So we don't know enough to properly critique it. We don't know enough about the subject. So you just end up with a very low level discussion. What practical suggestions would you give to someone in a primary setting to introduce logical fallacy? Ooh, well, that presupposes that you'd want to in a primary setting, but I actually think it's quite, I don't know, I'm not a primary school teacher, but I think it's graspable in the right context. Daniel Willingham has said, that small children can think critically about stuff that they know a lot about, and trained scientists can fail to think critically about stuff that they don't know much about. So, yeah, in the right context, but I can't really give you an example because, yeah, it's a little bit far away from my level of expertise.
Great, Greg, thank you very much for taking those questions, and colleagues, thanks for asking them. I think this there's so much of this that gets wrapped up in language. To Zoe's question, with the act of critiquing aid critical thinking, and it depends what you mean by critical thinking, right? And critical thinking within what domain and not within what domain. So really interesting, loads for us to take away there. Colleagues, a reminder, we're here every day at 11, and then you can watch everything that you've seen and heard again, or indeed go and have a look through the back catalogue of speakers that we've had. There's some fantastic presentations in there, either for you or for your schools to use. Last thank you to Greg. Thanks for joining us all the way from Australia, Greg. We love an international research at home, and colleagues, we hope to see you at a presentation again very soon. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.